brief, this is the agenda for tonight. We have our two speakers this evening. The first up is to give just some background about sanitizers and what they are and how to use and monitor them is Dr. Amanda Deering. Dr. Deering is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Food Sciences at Purdue University in Indiana. Her research focuses on internalization of human pathogenic bacteria in plants and the roots of pathogen contamination in plants. She also works on developing novel post-harvest sanitizers for reducing bacterial contamination on fresh produce. And she works directly with growers and industry through her role with Purdue Extension. So I welcome you tonight, Dr. Deering, to talk about sanitizers. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then we'll be followed, Dr. Deering's talk will be followed tonight by Phil Tocco, and we'll go ahead and introduce him a little bit later, closer to time.
Okay. Let's see now if I can share my screen. All right, can you guys see that?
I can.
All right. Well, first off, let me just thank everyone for having me here tonight. Like I said earlier, if you weren't on the call yet, I always enjoy talking about sanitizers. And so I realize that's a super weird thing to enjoy talking about. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and kind of what we'll start, I'm going to give you an overview and then we'll kind of go into some of the nitty gritty. But I'm not going to speak. I'm going to probably talk for about 40 minutes or so maybe. And I want to leave enough time for questions because I know this topic is usually one that there's quite a few questions on. All right, so what are sanitizers and what's the purpose of sanitizing? And you know, this is done, and if any of you guys have worked in retail food establishments, you've worked in food manufacturing facilities, and obviously on farms, sanitizers are in all those different environments. And it's really a measure, a hygienic measure that we use just to make sure that the food that we produce is safe as possible. And the goal is you're using these sanitizers following some sort of cleaning step where you're removing most of that physical debris, the dirt, and then you're coming in with a secondary step as a sanitization step where you're really killing off those last bacteria, sometimes fungi, whatever we're talking about. And I'll go into that more in just a minute. But it's that last little hit and you're killing what's remaining on the surface. We don't always kill everything that's on the surface. And so these good sanitizers will get around a 3-log reduction typically. And so what do I mean by log reduction? And that's always a question. So I'm a microbiologist, a food microbiologist by training. So we love to throw around these terms of logs and all this stuff. And so, but what does that actually mean? And so when we deal with sanitizers, what you'll hear people say a lot is what's the efficacy of the sanitizer? And that just really means that what is the log reduction? And so a log reduction is just based on this logarithmic scale. And so you can see a 1 log reduction, you're going to reduce the bacteria that's present by 90%. So if we start out with 1 million cells, we'd have 100,000 cells with 1 log reduction. You'll see 2 log reduction, the 3 log reduction. So a lot of, you know, the sanitizers that you'll see out, you know, is 99.99% of cells are killed. But depending on what that starting concentration started out with, right, we could still have quite a few. I mean, 99.99% killed sounds like a great number, but it could actually still be quite a few bacteria still present, just depending on what we started out as that original load, right? So we always have to keep that in mind. But so that's what they're talking when you hear log reduction or you hear efficacy or things like that. This is what we're actually talking about. So why use sanitizers? So typically in a packing house, we're going to have a lot of produce coming through there, right? And you're going to have things that could be contaminated, things that aren't contaminated. And they're all going through that same post-harvest. Sometimes it's a post-harvest, like a dump tank, or it's they're going through some sort of wash system where there's a spray bar that's applying the sanitizer. But in any event, these things are all getting commingled, right? And what we want to do with putting these sanitizers in is that we're cleaning up that wash water, and if potentially if there's bacteria that's on the surface, they can get killed in the process as well. And of course, the industry, we care about bacteria and these pathogenic bacteria because that's what causes illness. But as an industry, we focus on shelf life too, right? Because the longer that that product can remain in the store and have a chance to be sold, it's more money that is generated, right? So a lot of these sanitizers will also look at not only the pathogens of human health concern, but they're also going to look at some of these spoilage microorganisms. And some of the sanitizers will have that, they're going to advertise that fact on their label. We'll get more into that in just a second. So again, really, we do care. We want to avoid this cross-contamination, and that picture there is just a good example of where you could have this cross-contamination event. So adding a sanitizer just helps reduce the likelihood that this cross-contamination event happens, and again can also help improve the shelf life of the product. That's very important. So what is a pesticide? And so a lot of people will say, I can't believe a sanitizer is actually a pesticide. But a pesticide is any substance that you're trying to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest, right? And in the case of when we're using these post-harvest sanitizers, our pests are these pathogenic and spoilage bacteria or fungi or whatever we're looking to target to kill, right? So these post-harvest sanitizers actually are classified as pesticides because that's what they're doing, right? They're killing these pests that we want to control in our packing house or food contact surfaces as well. So pests can be anything, right? These are any living organisms that they're just not wanted or they cause damage. And so I'm sure we've all experienced pests. I've had a issue with mice this summer, which I never thought I'd have to deal with. So we've all had to deal with pests at some point in our life, right? But really that bottom part, when we're talking about post-harvest sanitizing and in the packing house, we're concerned about the microorganisms. So we're thinking bacteria, fungi, things like that. So I'll tell you just briefly about some of my background. I worked in the fresh cut industry. I still worked at Purdue, but I worked with their R&D department. And in that role, we tested a lot of different sanitizers, and that's kind of how I was doing that for about 5 years. So that's kind of how I kind of got interested in this whole using sanitizers and what are the best ones and which ones can we combine to help make a better sanitizer and things like that. So after doing that for a few years, I end up in the role that I'm in, and somebody came to me and said, well, which sanitizers can I use for washing fruits and vegetables? And I was like, oh, well, yeah. I mean, there must be a list somewhere, right? This must exist. This isn't this unknown thing. And the more I dig and the more I look, I can't find anything. Like, there was nothing, at least at this time. This is several years ago. I even hate to say it, probably close to 10 years ago. And so that's kind of what led us down this path of really trying to understand what these post-harvest sanitizers are and developing this material to help train others, educators as well as growers and regulatory agencies on what some of these sanitizers are, because that information at that time didn't exist. There's a lot, and I think at least will send out or has sent out information with a ton of resources on it. So there's so much more out there than what there was, so even 10 years ago. So I'm going to kind of talk about through this process. So what we're going to talk about today is identify if a sanitizer can be used for washing fresh fruits and vegetables. We're going to talk about what that product label is and why you care, why you should care about it. Who to contact if you have questions regarding post-harvest sanitizers. And then some of you guys on the call, I'm going to have to rely on you. I know kind of some of the rules in the Midwest here, but out east, I'm not entirely sure. And I'll go through what I know and you can help me fill in some of the blanks. And then I'll briefly talk about testing sanitizer concentration. And I believe this is something Phil is going to talk more about after we wrap up here. All right, so regulation of these sanitizers. So all post-harvest sanitizers are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. And what EPA does, so if I have a sanitizer, say that I want to get out onto the market that growers can use, what I have to do is provide a lot of data showing that it does what it says it does, kills these pests that I'm concerned of, the bacteria or fungi or whatever it is. And it also has to show that how the product kills that and not us, and how we make sure we use it correctly. Okay, so I would work with a lab or something like that. And we do some of that for some companies, providing that data for them so they can submit that to EPA to put that this product, their sanitizer, can be used for washing fruits and vegetables. Okay, so this is not a cheap process, and it's not a short process. So we'll talk more about how people try to get around this process in just a second. Okay, so post-harvest sanitizers also, they need to be approved by EPA, and we'll have a label, and I'll explain what that looks like in a second. But they also need to be approved in the state that they're used in. And so Indiana is a very bizarre state in the way that our regulatory components are arranged. So typically a lot of this stuff would go through your Department of Agriculture. But in Indiana, our Department of Agriculture, what's actually pretty new, and it doesn't have any regulatory authority. So in Indiana, our seeds and sanitizers or pesticides are regulated by the Office of the Indiana State Chemist. And then the other things such as fruit and vegetable on the regulatory side is regulated by our Department of Health. So I know our state, the organization is very different than most states. So I encourage you, if you're not, to contact your extension educators, your extension specialists, if you're unsure of who to contact in your state regarding this. So there's probably somebody, typically like in Ohio, I know that's in the Department of Agriculture that regulates these products. So we can talk about that at the end, and I'm sure the educators here on the call will have more information specific to the eastern region. Okay, so this is just a map, this National Pesticide Information Retrieval System. And so you'll see these ones in blue are all the ones that have data uploaded. You can search this data, and these will list all the pesticides that are registered within your state. So you can see if some of these states, there's no data, so they don't participate in that program. And so if you're from one of those states, it's a little bit trickier sometimes to get that information, but you still can. Usually, like in Illinois, I'm familiar with, I have, at least in the past, identified the person who does that. And then there's a couple of states who just don't submit that on a regular basis, and regular basis is typically annually. These things are updated. But you can find this if you just search for that, the National Pesticide Information. You can find this and search for any pesticides that are registered in your state. And I'm sure everyone's just dying to get out there and look up the pesticides. All right, so all products that are registered with EPA will have a registration number on the label. And what this does, it means that EPA has looked through, like I said, all that toxicology data, the toxicity data, looking at the efficacy data, And what they, at the end of the day, they'll say, okay, if you use this sanitizer the way it's labeled, it will not pose health risks to you. But that's if you're using it according to the label, all right? And we find a lot of people that, you know, if a little is good, a lot's better. But that's not the case with sanitizers. We always want to make sure we follow the label, because some of these things used off label can be quite dangerous, and dangerous to your workers too. And a lot of times I've been in places where it totally, you know, been in packing houses where you walk in and your eyes just immediately start watering and your nose is running. And it's not, they didn't intentionally use it off label. It's just that the device that they were using to measure the concentration was off, right? So, you know, it happens, and those, we'll talk a little bit more about measuring concentrations, but it's very, very important they use it according to label directions. So I always tell growers, they'll say, hey, Amanda, I have this product. What do you think about it? And I say, give me the EPA number. So that's the first thing I'm going to look for, to make sure that that's a product that we can actually use in the packing house. Okay, if you do not see an EPA label that's clearly displayed on the product, that's the red flag for me. So if they're trying to hide this, there'd be no reason. If it's all legit, there's no reason to hide it. So if it's really hard to find, then it's probably, there's a reason why they're hiding it somewhere, right? So that would just be a red flag for me. I would dig deeper into this. And you can also then contact the manufacturer if you don't see an EPA number, or maybe it was just, you know, who knows the reason, but maybe it was just a mistake or whatnot. But again, I put the link here where you can find EPA numbers and the information about those products. So I see, you know, growers will come to me and say, you know, Amanda, here's this sales guy came by and said, this is the best sanitizer, you know, since sliced bread. And it sends me pictures of it. You know, and these labels, I've seen all, and I just picked a couple. They'll see all these different logos, and it's organic, and it may be like, but FDA, like GRAS approved, so that's generally regarded as safe. So EPA would never use a terminology that another agency used. They just don't operate like that, right? They all have their own words that they're going to use. So when you see things like that, it's a sort of a red flag. And unfortunately, we see it, at least I see it more than I'd like to see it. But it's out there, but that does not replace. So I've heard that too. Well, we did this, so we don't have to get registered with EPA. And that's not true. So these don't replace having the EPA registration. They can have these other things. That's, you know, whatever they've done, other certifications, great. But that doesn't replace the EPA number. So what you can have though, and I see some of these products every once in a while, I rarely see them, and you guys may see them more than I do. But EPA does have this list, and I'll show the list, I think it's on the next slide, that they have 30 compounds that they do not regulate. And so basically, you can make a sanitizer with some of these 30 compounds, and you would not have to go through EPA approval. However, they cannot bear claims that they kill pathogens, that they kill things that pose a threat to human health. They can't have those claims on these type of products. Okay, and they only can have those products, so those chemicals in that product. So let me see, yeah, so here's that list. So you see, the one I've seen is the thyme oil. I've seen that a couple times come through. And some of these like rosemary and mint, and you guys may have seen other products like that. But so they can do that, but as long as they can't say though they're out there to kill pathogens, they can't make that claim. Okay, but these products could be used. All right, so let's look at So here's this label, and these are randomly picked. I'm not endorsing any chemicals by the ones I picked. These are ones I just randomly picked because I had the labels and put them in here. So there's no endorsement of any product whatsoever. So this is Tsunami. So again, I just highlighted what that EPA number looks like. So that's what we're looking for. What else is this label telling you? It's telling us what some of those active ingredients are. So this is a proxyacetic acid based sanitizer, and just some of the other properties of it, which almost that nobody really cares. Well, you care, but the EPA one is the biggest one that you're going to be looking for. And so what does this EPA number really mean? And so these first two sets, so this X and the Y part, that's the company ID, and then the product ID. So it's who made it and what it is. And this last one, which they may have, is a distributor suffix. And what that means is basically it's a private label. And I always give the example, maybe this isn't the best, but it may always make sense to me. It's like when you have Dole salad and they package it at the Dole plant, but they put it in a Kroger packaging, right? It's that same kind of deal. So you could have this private label, it's product that's made by this company, it's the same product, but then they're gonna put that last chunk on the end that IDs it as their private label. Okay, so that's what those numbers mean. Okay, so these EPA numbers can be found on the pesticide product label system website. And again, you can search that product name, company name in that EPA registration number. And I gave a link to that below. And that'll give you some more information too about the product if you need it. So again, I'm just gonna say, let me see if I can go to the next slide. I think it'll explain, yeah. So this is what gets people caught up a lot of the times. And I know it doesn't make any sense, but what happens, so say you have a chlorine-based product, right? Sodium hypochlorite. And it has a label for fruit and vegetable wash. And that same percentage and so same thing, sodium hypochlorite, it's chlorine for a pool, right? And typically the chlorine for the pool is going to be a third or a quarter or whatever percentage less than that product that's going to be labeled fruit and vegetable wash. And that's just the way it is. That's how the companies work. However, right, so I have this example here. So if you look at this EPA number, it's the same thing. We have though 20 different products in Indiana that have that same EPA number. And some of these may or may not be labeled for fruit and vegetable wash. So if it doesn't have that label that specifically says for washing fruits and vegetables, or whatever you want to do with it. So if it's for food contact surfaces, it has to say that on the label. It may not say that on the bottle because sometimes they're short on space, but you have to go back to the master label, and as long as it has it there, you can use it. If it doesn't, it shouldn't be used. And I know that people give me this argument every time, and I completely agree. It's the same product. Why can't we use it? That's how these products are regulated. All right, so I kind of went through this slide already, but again, and I'll preach this a couple, probably more times before we get to the end here. Just make sure that label is followed exactly. And that's like, this is a safety thing. We want to make sure and tell our employees that as well. All right, so here's we're going back to the Tsunami label. And again, so we first found it had an EPA label, so that's great. And now this is telling us what we can use this product for, right? So directions for use, and it specifically says for pathogen reduction and control in fruit and vegetable processing waters. So it needs to say something along those lines, but it has to be specific for fruit and vegetable wash waters. And then it's going to give you how to do it. Okay, so if you're doing a batch system, if you're doing a continuous system, like you have a dosatron and you're dosing it in, you know, it's going to tell you how to do that and what concentrations. Okay, so this is just the directions for use, and every sanitizer, EPA approved sanitizer, will have this. Again, sometimes it may not be on that bottle because the space is just too short. You might have to go back, find that master label online and get that information. So what should that label tell you? It should tell you the concentration for use and how to dilute it, the contact time, and so that means how long do you leave that sanitizer on a fruit or vegetable or on your packing line or on your food contact surface. Possibly what types of organisms the product kills. So it gives directions for, say, Listeria monocytogenes, foliage microorganisms, whatever. It will tell you the final rinse with potable water is needed following the use of the sanitizer, which most chlorine and chlorine dioxide products will require that final rinse. Whereas a lot of the proxyacetic acids, I don't know really, off the top of my head, I don't know of any that do require a rinse. On the proxyacetic acid products. And then also first aid procedures. So what happens if someone gets this in their eyes, they drink it, whatnot. So they also might give you some of the benefits, right? And so this is the company just saying, hey, look, here's why you want to use our products. And this may or may not be on the bottle, typically not, because there's just not enough space, but this would be information you'd find back in the master label, right? And this is giving you, so hey, here's why you want to use this, my product, right? And so they'll have that information. And then, you know, so in this example, they're telling you, so we got a 99.9% reduction, so that's a 3-log reduction of E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, and vegetable processing waters. So they did the research to be able to make this claim. So if they did research somewhere to say this, and so they can put that information on their label, which is good. I typically tell growers, you know, go for these ones that have the public health concern ones. I know there's been some issues with people getting third-party audits, that if they're using a sanitizer that isn't labeled for killing pathogens, that the auditors don't like that, and they may or may not lose points. So again, just to be on the safe side, I typically tell growers to do that, but you know, it's up to what their needs are too. So here's just another example of a label. So you can see at the bottom, right, it has your EPA number. It's telling you what this is, so 12.5% sodium hypochlorite. It's telling you here's where you can use it in some of those places, but right now this hasn't given me enough information that I can use it as a fruit and vegetable wash. But then if I keep going, there it is. So it's telling you specifically for fruit and vegetable wash, here's what you do, right? And it's telling me that chlorine concentration, how to dilute it, and things like that. So you have to, these labels, sometimes they'll have specific guidelines for particular commodities. So how you, and I'm just picking these randomly. So how you wash, say, broccoli would have a different concentration than what you wash apples. So some products have that, others do not, right? It's just fruit and vegetable wash and it's all the same concentration. So just be aware of that when you're choosing that sanitizer that you're going to use. So again, this is telling us how to dilute it. So how you end up at that final concentration. And this is also going to give us the environmental hazards. So every sanitizer should also tell you how to dispose of it. And if you have questions, reach out to in your state agency. So in Indiana, it's our Indiana Department of Environmental Management, IDEM. I don't know what it is for every state, but that would be the regulatory body. If you're using this in your post-harvest wash how do you get rid of it safely? And they would be able to give you that information. Okay, and this also tells you storage and disposal. So they'll all have that as well. So how do you just store this chemical, how do you dispose of it? And that information is there. And here's just our first aid information on chloride. So, sorry, that's my dog. he sort of sounds like a woman at times. Let's keep going. Yeah, could you grab him, please? All right, so what products can be used? So once you have this product, again, you want to make sure it's registered with the EPA, is registered with the state that you're using it in. It may be, you may be in one of those states that are not submitting data to this or not participating in this. So that, again, I'm not entirely sure if your state does not participate, how that goes on, but I'm sure we could figure that out. We could get that information. But so there's just some information on that. And so I did provide to Lisa a handout that we put together, and really how we ended up having to do this. It was a horrible process. We ended up going through, we went to the Office of the Indiana State Chemist, and they keep on file every single label, like physical label, that is approved sanitizers in Indiana. So we literally had to go through all of them and read through those labels and to see if it said it's for fruit and vegetable washing. So I put together that list. That's an Indiana approved list, but it at least would give you a good starting point. So all those sanitizers, there's quite a few on there, I think close to 50. And that's not, that's not exhaustive either, right? So there could be other ones, I'm not saying that, but it just is a good starting point. So those are approved for fruit and vegetable washes, and you can see if it's approved in your state and go down the chain with that. All right, so measuring concentration, like I said, I think Phil is going to talk a lot more about this, but you definitely need to be able to measure that concentration and ensure that you're using it at that proper concentration. And so the example I gave before about going into this packed house and your eyes watering, your nose running, and so they were running chlorine dioxide, and they had a Hawk meter, like what's in the middle there, and it measures the concentration, and they were doing it. And I said, you know, what are you running this at? And the guy said, oh, it's 5 parts per million chlorine dioxide. And I said, there's no way. I said, I bet you this is 60 to 80 parts per million. And you know, you felt bad. There's all these workers working in this. And so come to find out, we start digging around and messing with their Hawk meter, and turns out the limit on the Hawk meter was 5 parts per million. So anything over 5 parts per million, it could be 100 parts per million, it's still going to say 5 parts per million on the Hawk meter, right? Same with these test strips. So what does that say? 160 is the highest on the test strips, the PAA strips on the left-hand side. So 160 will look that color, as will 360, right? So if you're up at that high end, you're going to want to make sure you dilute that out, that you can accurately see that concentration, right? So if you think you should be at 160, dilute that in half, and then go, you should be in that 60 to 80 range, right? So it's really important. And, you know, these are things people don't, it's not intentional that they're using some of these products off label, but it's the limitations of these things, the things that we have to measure the concentrations. Any sanitizer that you're using, if it's a chlorine-based one, you can typically buy those strips even at Walmart because they're used for the for swimming pools. You just want to make sure you're measuring free available chlorine, and you can get those. But most companies who sell these products will sell these kits to measure concentrations, and then once you know what you need, a lot of these things you can buy on Amazon, and they're a lot cheaper. And so I'll find them for growers who ask me about it, and then give them that info. Right, so yeah, so here's my know the limitations. So this color is 160, but it also could be 500, right? It's everything above 160 is going to turn that color as well. right? So we just want to make sure we understand the limitations of whatever we're using to measure that concentration. So final thoughts on the sanitizers and measuring those concentrations. If you're not sure if you don't know how to measure the concentration, the first step is to ask the manufacturer. They'll give you, either they have it or they'll provide that information to you. Like I said, a lot of times you can find that on Amazon or other sites at a lower cost. So that's always a resource. I found, so I've been doing this about 10 years, and I think in that time, in the beginning, when growers were getting third-party audits, and maybe that's just in our area, the auditors never really seemed to question if, okay, I use a sanitizer, great. But they didn't really go into what that sanitizer was and if they could measure the concentration correctly. And I know from the audits that I've been involved in recently, that is an absolute. They'll ask, show me, okay, you're running this at 25 parts per million. Show me how you know it's 25 parts per million. And that has to be demonstrated as part of the audit. So it's really important now, if you're a grower and you're going through third-party audits, that you do know how to do that. And so I also get the question, do I have to watch my produce, A? And if I wash it, do I have to use a sanitizer? And the answer is no, right? If we go back to the produce safety rule, there's no requirement. So that's on the federal, on the Food Safety Modernization Act side. There's no requirement for washing. Sometimes I feel you can make things a lot worse by introducing water into the mix. And so, but it depends on what you as a grower wants, and sometimes what the buyer wants. So to sell to certain places, they'll require that you have some sort of sanitizer step in your post-harvest processing. So it just depends. But if you're going to do it, just make sure everything is done correctly. And that's probably my best advice that I give growers all the time. All right, so we have a little less than 20 minutes left. I'm happy if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, or do it via chat, or however you guys want to do it. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Yeah, there are definitely a few questions in the chat, and people should also feel free to speak up as we go. What's that? What's that?
You want me to stop sharing my screen and then we can?
Sure. And then we can have a little bit more face to face. I'll throw out the first question just because one of the reasons I really wanted to cover this topic is that I know a lot of growers in Massachusetts and in the Northeast are not very used to using sanitizers and wash water. They're not necessarily comfortable with it, and certainly not super adept at monitoring, and really would like some help with that. So just some points about, so some of the tools that are available from mostly the strips all the way to like the ORP meter might not be familiar with. And I just wanted to, kind of clarify for folks that there are these differences, that they might look alike, a pH strip versus a free chlorine strip versus a peroxyacetic acid strip, and sort of you have to make sure that you're using the right tool for the job. So maybe just talk a little bit more about that, and then kind of what other tools might be available, like an ORP meter, and whether or not that's practical for a kind of small scale grower.
Yeah, so that's right. So there's a lot of these test strips that in principle, they look the same, right? They're all based on some sort of colorimetric test. They're turning a different color. So that could be, say, a pH measurement. There's a colorimetric assay. I think I had in one of I did in the last slide or second to last slide, if you need to measure pH, and so most sanitizers you don't really have to. The only one that really requires it is chlorine. And it's kind of a bummer because it's the cheapest one too, right? So if you want to run a chlorine-based product in your wash water, you really want to keep that pH around 6.5 to 7.5. And the reason being, if you go on either side of that pH range, the efficacy just tanks. So you're just using more and more products and you're not getting any better kill effects. So you can keep dumping product in there. And so I always tell growers, well, you might as well just be throwing dollar bills in that dump tank, because you're not getting anything more for that, adding that much sanitizer if your pH is, say, 10. And around our part of the world, our water is super hard. And so to have water that's like a pH of 9 is not unheard of. So we definitely run into that. A lot of the other sanitizers, though, when you talk about pH, they're pretty forgiving. So chlorine dioxide, that's 4 to 9. I mean, really forgiving. PAA, that's actually going to bring the pH down. So, that might be something you take into consideration for your equipment. So if you're using hard plastics or things like that, there could be some damage, whereas chlorine, even though it's cheap, it can be corrosive. I guess I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. Everything it's a trade-off, right? And for the small growers, I don't think you want to invest in any of these equipment. So like an ORP meter that measures the oxidation reduction potential. And that's typically, we see that in a lot of chlorine and chlorine-based products, what will give us this value that tells that you're in this specific range. And a lot of these sanitizers will tell you what that ORP value should be, as well as what the parts per million value should be. And I'll tell you, I've been into places where, again, they'll say, oh, look, no, my ORP meter says 700. And there's no way, it's way over that. And so they typically, even growers that are running the fancy equipment, they're almost always just double checking with a different, if it's just a strip or whatever, just to make sure that that equipment is working. So to me, especially a smaller grower, I don't think it's really good to invest in some of this fancy equipment. I think you can do pretty much the same things with some of not using those technologies. But if that's what you're into, I tell you, any of those chemical companies will get you an ORP meter and get you a dosatron and get you all hooked up, but it just might be overkill for what you need.
Okay. So the take home is use the strips appropriate for the material and within the range that you're trying to measure, and kind of play around with them to make sure that they're consistent and you're getting a good.
Yep, and be careful if you're at that, what you're relying on is that high-end range of your strip. Mm-hmm. Just make sure that that's really where you're at.
Okay, thank you. So from the chat here, someone did ask, speaking about the label of some of these materials, it says if it lists a specific, they asked if it lists a specific concentration for a specific fruit or vegetable, can you only use it for that fruit or vegetable? I don't know necessarily if that's how some of these labels are listed, if it's sort of generally veg or fruit.
Well, so it depends on the chemical. So I've seen some that they'll give the parameters for fruit and vegetable wash, and then they'll go back into specific commodities and give you that concentration for that. So if it was in that scenario, I mean, I think if your commodity is not one of the ones listed, you use it as a general use, there'd be no issues whatsoever. Most of the time, I would say when they list these specific commodities, they try to be pretty all-encompassing from the ones I've seen. And there may be some that aren't like that, but most of these companies would not want to limit themselves to one particular industry, right? They want it as broadly defined as possible. And so that might be something, either you talk to your, right, if you have your heart set on this one chemical, and I'll tell you, we could find another one that would work for you. But if you're dead set on using this one chemical and it doesn't have your specific commodity, I think that would be a question for your regulatory agency of whether or not you could actually use it. I would guess if there's a commodity that's similar, so you're doing honeydew and they only have a label for watermelon, those are pretty similar in how they're structured and things like that it might work. But I would not, I guess I wouldn't chance it. I would make sure you had that regulatory approval. But I'll tell you, we could find other sanitizers for you. It wouldn't be, there's enough out there, you wouldn't have to be limited to just that.
Great. Okay. My colleague here asked if you want to talk a little bit about the implications of using too much sanitizer, whether it's chlorine or PAA, and maybe the implications are different for each of those, but is there risk of, and you talked about the smell in the room, so I'm imagining it could be harmful to workers. And but she asked, could it injure produce? Could it injure workers? Is it harmful to consumers potentially? Talk maybe about some of the risks of mismeasuring and having too high a concentration of sanitizer.
So I have done work where we looked, and this wasn't with leafy greens, and so I'd say that's probably your most susceptible commodity, right? That's everything. Leafy greens, they like their perfect little space, and that's about it. But we tested high concentrations of chlorine dioxide, and you'd actually see yellowing and browning of some of the edges, of the cut edges. So there could be, I don't know with every product and how high you would have to get to cause actual physical damage, but I know peroxyacetic, if any of you guys have worked with peroxyacetic acid-based products, you get your hands in that and it burns like crazy and it turns your hands white. And it goes away eventually, but you know, again, you just want to be careful with that. And I'll tell you too, with a lot of those concentrations, when they're that high, you get a lot of that gassing off, and especially chlorine and chlorine dioxide. That makes for a very scary situation if that happens, right? So follow the label and just be careful. Have your PPE, and those labels will tell you what that is. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Is that Sue's nodding? That was her question.
Okay, great.
Let's see. Also in the chat here, another colleague asked, how do you recommend lowering pH when you are working with hard water?
So there are products out there. They have different products as long as they're labeled. So you can add, so citric acid will lower that pH. That's typically food grade. You can use that. A lot of these sanitizer companies will sell along, if they're selling a chlorine-based product, they'll recommend, they know ones that they've worked with, and they'll recommend how to bring that pH down. Those are mostly the ones I've seen. I'm sure there's commercial products available, and again, that manufacturer will have them. I've seen different ones.
Great. And another person asked about, we're talking about resistance. So he says, in past years, we were told antibacterial hand soap was a bad idea, made our environment too clean and our immune system, our immune response not sufficiently challenged. Similarly, antibiotics in meat production, considered a contributor to antibiotic resistant bacteria. So how do these examples relate to the use of sanitizers for crops?
Well, so I'll tell you, if you work with the fresh cut industry, almost all of them are using some sort of chlorine products. And I would guess if you talk to whoever the senior VP is, that probably keeps him or her up at night worrying about that. Because this has been something that has come up. You know, what happens if you start getting these pathogens that are resistant to chlorine and chlorine dioxide and some of these common sanitizers, you know, that we use every day. To my knowledge, I haven't come across, I mean, we do have definitely E. coli that are acid tolerant. We have, you know, some that can be tolerant that we know have come out of some of these industries, like the meat industry. I don't know of let's say an E. coli strain that's chlorine tolerant that can live through most of these. I don't know of anything that exists. Is it possible? You know, that's always the fear, you know? So I recommend to the growers that I work with. So typically we can run 2 sanitizers together, and that might be how you get rid of some of these issues, right? You run a chlorine and then a PAA, say a rinse, and then a final PAA wash, because most of these lines will have multiple spray bars, so you can run different products. Is that a pain in the butt? Yeah, you know, but you can do that, and that might get around, you know, that sort of thing happening, because you're kind of having two different selection, you know, two different sanitizers that are working in combination.
Okay.
But I hope that answers the question. It wasn't a super defined answer.
I think so. And if the person who asked it wanted to speak up, if you had a follow-up, feel free. But I will go ahead and ask a couple more questions that are here in the chat. With active chlorine test strips that have a range of 25 to 2000 ppm, is that a reliable range, or would you recommend something a little tighter than that?
Yeah, I would go a little tighter than that. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're doing. You're never going to have, in the fresh produce business, you're never going to have anything 2000 parts per million chlorine. So I would get back down, you know, if you can pick that strip, that the indicator is sort of that range where you want to be is sort of in the middle. That's probably the best advice.
Okay, great. And like you said, if you're measuring above that higher range of your strip, you want to dilute the water that you're working with so that you can get a better measure, right?
Yep.
Let's see. Oh, this is a good question. A farm I visited recently was using chlorine and copper ions in their wash water. Have you heard of using copper ions? And I'll throw in the question that we talked about over email with, on top of copper ionizers, people have also talked about ozone and UV, and if you had any thoughts about those different devices and these kind of small farm applications.
Yeah, so like I said, working with the fresh cut industry for as long as I did in R&D, I think we tried everything known to man. So I do have experience working with those copper sulfate generators. So it all goes back, and does it have a label for fruit and vegetable washing with that, whatever is being generated out of that system? You know, a lot of the stuff I did in R&D, we didn't care at that point that it had a label or not. We figured we'd go get a label for it if that's what we needed to do. But so make sure, first off, you know, make sure there's a label for washing fruits and vegetables, whatever is generated out of those systems. I've worked with ozone. I've worked with UV on, you know, I don't want to say that anyone's system is bad, but I would highly encourage you, if you're thinking about purchasing one of those systems, they're not a cheap date, they're expensive, and get how they determine, so that you can use whatever's generated from that system that has approval to use for fruit and vegetable wash, or whatever you're going to do with it. And then see how those companies generated that efficacy data, right? And so get with your extension educator, you know, contact your extension specialists and ask those questions. Have them look at it too if you're unsure. Because before you put that kind of money in a system like that, we want to make sure you're getting your bang for your buck. My experience with ozone, it is very unstable. So if you can like bubble it in right where you're using it, then it's great. But if it has to move, you know, so say like in a flume, or it's moving in you're generating here, and if you even have to go back up through a spray wire, it's just not stable enough to be effective. But that's just from my experience. I'm not saying anything's one good or bad. And same with UV. To me, those continuous systems you need a long exposure time to really do well with UV. And you have to keep in mind with UV, that bacteria has to be exposed. So using UV to sanitize cantaloupe is probably not ever really going to work well, because there's just too many nooks and crannies the bacteria can hide in. You know, but not, again, I don't want to say that, I'm not trying to say any one of these things are horrible, but they all have limitations, and you should really consider those before you invest a lot of money into those systems.
Okay. Oh, and I guess for the question too, she had mentioned that they use chlorine and copper ions, and would you recommend that use of two different?
Yeah, as long as they're compatible chemistries. You know, all the stuff I've done, I've seen, you know, there's benefits from adding the two chemicals. You just have to make certain that those chemistries are compatible and you're not producing some weird off gas that will wipe out your pack house.
Yeah. And those compatibilities should be on the label for the pesticide that you're using, or you should get that from the whoever's selling you this device.
Correct. I would ask them that information. They should be able to tell you that.
Okay, great. Let's see, just a couple more questions here. Chris Callahan mentioned that, back to the resistance question, just made a comment that thinking about resistance is another good reason to make sure that you're using it within the labeled rate. But just keeping it within the ppm range that the label recommends. And then the last question in the chat here, and we have about 1 more minute before we're going to have Phil Tocco come on. So someone asked, where do you recommend purchasing Tsunami or other products if you only need a small quantity?
Yeah. That is a good question. So I will say, I don't have a great answer. I will say, as long as you keep a lot of these products, keep them out of the sunlight and keep them cool, that they're not hot, they're going to last a while, not forever. And I love when I go into these places and you see this old dusty bottle of Sanidate that looks like it's been there for 800 years, right? And it's like, yeah, that's probably not very much active ingredient left in that, right? But so if you do have to purchase, I don't have a great answer. And I would check at some of these, the farm stores, the online stores, ask, and this might be something maybe, you're going to have this around for a long time, but just really focus on how you can properly store it to maintain, so maybe you can use it for at least a couple or more growing seasons. I guess that's like the best answer I have. I know it's not good, but
it's a problem with pesticides in general.
It is, and they're not cheap either. That's part of the problem. I mean, they're super expensive, and but
agreed. Well, thank you so much. If people do continue to have questions, you can add them to the chat and we'll try and address them later, or maybe I can send them to you afterwards to follow up or something if people do have more questions.
Yep, happy
so thank you so much. What's that?
Happy to take a stab at it.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the presentation. So now I want to introduce Phil Tocco, who has come on here. He's a food safety educator at Michigan State University, been an extension educator for over 14 years, it says on the website there, and he is an incredible resource to growers, to regulators, to other educators, and all kinds of topics related to farm food safety. So I'm really happy to introduce Phil. If you were here last week, you got to see him walk through a water system inspection, and I think this demo that he's going to show us is going to be also cool. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen there, Phil.
Sure thing. It's coming your way now. We'll unpack this. I'm at a disadvantage because I'm not sure what Amanda shared before, but this will get you started. the point of that, let's unpack that video just a little bit. So to sort of give you a little background, I had a Twilight meeting a while back, a couple years ago at a small farm, and I went to the small farm, and in the corner I saw that proverbial dusty bottle of Sanidate 5.0, and it looked. I was like, oh, cool, you got yourself some Sanidate. You use Sanidate, and the gal said, the main farmer said, no, I don't use the Sanidate. I'm like, so you have a bottle of Sanidate in the corner? She says, yeah, I purchased a bottle of Sanidate and I brought it home, but I don't know how to open the bottle. And this just goes to show that we extension folks, we focus on a whole host of things, and we worry about, validation and verification. But if we don't know how to open the bottle, then it doesn't matter all that other fancy stuff down the line. So really focusing on the first step, like, how do I open the doggone cap? So that's why I talked about the bung cap in that video. That bung cap opener is specifically designed to fit in there, and it's a $5 item that you can buy on Amazon. Real simple, real easy to open up the cap. So that's one thing right there. You'll notice in the video too that once we got into the PPE, if you looked at the Sanidate container, it had a spigot on it. It was a Teflon coated plastic spigot, and so that screws in place. Once you get that little bung cap off, you can screw that in place, and then all of a sudden now you have a nice, easily regulatable way of getting Sanidate out of a large mini bulk. What some of the biggest concerns people have is it smells bad, it burns my eyes, it makes me cry, it burns my skin, it does all this stuff. So making sure that you have a way where you're not touching or even coming into contact with the material so that it goes literally from the mini bulk into your container is so very important. Yes, it's important to put PPE on, but it's also important to think about keeping it contained. So that secondary, Chris Callahan's secondary containment of having that little thingy there, that's really another important thing, because then what you do is you're pouring it right into that graduated cylinder thing, and you don't smell it, it doesn't splash, it stays inside the container. So all of those things are really important. Keeping things safe for you, increasing your confidence in your ability to use things is really important. And I definitely would encourage you. Chris is on the line, but Chris's his fact sheet through Instructables, I think, is out there, and I'm pretty sure that Lisa put it in the chat. So look for it. The doser is really it's a relatively easy thing to put together. You can put it together for like 25, 30 bucks and maybe an hour's worth of your time. Real cheap, real easy. And all of a sudden it turns this home gardener person who uses Sanidate in his washing of his produce from his garden, it turns it from something that's kind of difficult to something that's actually pretty easy to do, and it decreases the amount of time and energy I have to worry about measuring out 2 tablespoons into my 5-gallon bucket and all that jazz. So that's a big step. Now there are a bunch of words that are bandied about. When those of us food safety types, we talk about validation and we talk about verification. Can someone do folks know the difference? Yes, no, right? No. Yes, I see a couple of cameras on. You could just shout it out. Okay, no, okay. So in the video, I talked about verification, okay? Verification is, I've got a process, I'm using the process, I wanna make sure that I've got what it's like. So validation is, am I doing the right thing? Verification is, am I doing the thing right? So I'm making sure that I'm doing the thing right by verifying. So I've measured out a certain amount that's supposed to give me 85 parts per million of PAA in my 5-gallon bucket. So now I'm verifying that indeed that's the concentration that's in that water. So that's what I was doing in that last step, was verifying. A scientist has validated that if you have 85 parts per million in the water, it's going to control bacteria to the level that I want it controlled. So they validated the process. I'm verifying that I have what it takes to carry the process out. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we do stuff like that, we use validated processes. It's important we use validated processes, but it's also important that we verify those processes. For those of you small farmers out there, do you verify other processes on your farm? Does anyone want to share a process that you verify? Oh, don't jump at once. Who cleans their buckets in their harvest containers? Does everybody clean their harvest containers in their buckets? At least once a year? Okay, maybe, okay. So you guys can, if you've got the bandwidth, feel free to turn on your videos. It's okay. Or turn on your audio so you can talk to me. For those of you that clean your harvest buckets, do you have your harvest workers check the buckets to make sure they're clean enough to put product in? That's a verification step, right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about verification. It's just making sure that the person, that the process you have in place is still working. So that's fairly important. I've got there's 14 things in chat. We probably should handle those because I don't know what folks there. You want to read them off?
Well, most of them were just people being totally amazed by your video and commenting on your Fecal Fred's mustache. So there were a lot of, a lot of appreciation. And we did include a link to the doser, but there is one question out of all of that. And they ask where you get the dispenser that screws onto the jug, and I'm wondering if he means the spigot there, and does that come
so
with
the glorious thing about Chris's Instructable is he has a parts list, and each one of those parts is clickable, and it goes right to the Amazon or the eBay, wherever you can buy it. So I mean, Chris has done the legwork for you in terms of being able to find all that stuff. He didn't know I was going to brag on him quite that much. I told him I was going to brag on him. I just didn't tell him it was going to brag on him quite so much. So it's all there. Oh, doggone, here's the link to the valve. The parts list is a broken link. Okay.
so it's in there.
Iodine for cleaning and sanitizing the harvest bucket. Iodine for washing milk cans. If there, I don't know, I think there's a food contact surface labeling for iodine. I don't usually use iodine. I'm using Sanidate typically So let me unpack that question, Lucy, just a little bit. So we recognize that cleaning and sanitizing are two separate functions, right? The cleaning requires some kind of surfactant, that it requires some scrubbing action, and then it requires a certain amount of rinsing. Then we come in with the sanitizer. The iodine is the iodophores tend to be a sanitizer, and I don't know of any iodophores, and this, help me out if I'm incorrect. Did she leave already? She may have left. Amanda, do you know of any iodophores that are cleaners as well?
No, not off the top of my head. And as long as that had a label so in that scenario with the buckets, as long as it had a product label for food contact services and you followed that step, that would be okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know of one.
Yeah, so I guess you want to make sure you do the cleaning first with the surfactant. And again, the other thing too to keep in mind is what kind of junk you're dealing with. So like I don't know if some of you, if you have an apple orchard or you've been on apple orchards and seen an apple packing line that does any kind of waxing on it, the waxes can get on surfaces, and those waxes, like if you've waxed apples, that wax does not come off easy. And in fact, soap and water is not going to cut it. And typically what I recommend with folks is to use an alcohol-based cleaner to clean off, because the alcohol will break up the wax a whole lot better than any kind of water-based cleaner. And so that's definitely something. In the case of something, if you've got onions that are dry and you want to keep them dry, you need to think in terms of dry cleaning. What kind of dry cleaning steps? Does anyone do any dry cleaning out there? Anyone want to share dry cleaning stories? So what might be something that you would use to do with dry cleaning? Let's start there. Let's think through it. What do you think the first step might be? Man, it's the end of the night, man. I can just tell you how like, so let's think. Okay, so we have two choices. We can either suck it up or blow it out, right? So if we suck it up, that's probably better because blowing it out isn't real good because we could create dust clouds in the air and then our dirt gets deposited elsewhere. And that can cross-contaminate stuff, right? So a shop vac, sucking up all the dirt through a HEPA filter, that'd be they're usually equipped with sort of a HEPA filter kind of thing. So that might be a good choice for a first cleaning step, right? And then we need, once we've cleaned it, once we've removed the dirt, the physical removal of the dirt, the next step would be what? We've cleaned and now we sanitize, right? So that then the sanitizing is okay. I want to not use, and I don't want to use something that is going to be wet and leave wet residual water, right? Because humidity, particularly with onions and garlic, is another one where you really don't want to, have a lot of residual water. You want to use a non-water-based sanitizer. So you can buy something called an alcohol quat or a quaternary ammonia that's based in alcohol that can do your sanitizing, as an example. Now, I am not recommending that you, if you've got garlic stored or if you've got onions stored, that you do this on a daily basis. Remove the onions, clean things out, sanitize them, and then put the onions back. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But what I am suggesting is before you fill the box with onions or before you rack up the garlic to dry, that you think about cleaning that space and sanitizing that space, preparing it for the crop to go in there. Does that make sense? Okay. So thinking about that a little more holistically, there's a lot of folks that may just sweep an area out and say, okay, that's good enough. But it's important to think about cleaning and sanitizing, even on a small scale, and can be done relatively effectively, efficiently, and appropriately for the crop that you're trying to store. Okay. Any other questions? So a couple things that were brought up in the video that I haven't talked about yet. Making sure that your test strips are not expired is really, really important. Sometimes you'll see, particularly with pH test strips, you'll see the pH kind of, if the further away it is from the expiration date, you're going to see changes in what pH registers. You get what you pay for when you buy test strips. So if you get the really, really cheap ones from the restaurant supply store, you're going to get a really, really cheap product. So be thoughtful about making sure if it's important for you to be accurate, make sure that you buy good test strips. And this is something actually, if you check in with Amanda Kinchla is she at UMass? So Amanda did some work way back on looking at different test strips. I think it was Amanda that did different test strips and how different.
Robert Haddad at Cornell who did it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. I get confused. So everything out east is all one big smear anyway, right? Just kidding. Sorry. So Robert Haddad at Cornell did some research on looking at test strips and which test strips, how they varied from brand to brand. And there is a variation. So it's really important to think when you're buying test strips, not to change horses in the middle of the season. I mean, it's okay to change from one season to the next, but when you're in the middle of the season, don't change. That's important for one thing. Another key thing to think about is like if you make sure that you get the test strip for what you're actually measuring. So for instance, if you're looking at chlorine, you can get total chlorine test strips or you can get free chlorine test strips. What do you want to measure typically? If we're looking at sanitizer and wash water, what do we want to measure? Do we want to measure total chlorine or do we want to measure free chlorine? Just yell it out.
Free chlorine.
Yay, free chlorine. That's what we want. Okay. So that's exactly, we want to make sure that we get the right management tool. When we're talking about PAA, the other thing too is the right range, because you can get free chlorine that is really tight, like up to five parts per million, or you can get it up to 1,000 parts per million, or no, I can't get it up to 1,000, up to like 500 parts per million. So making sure that the range is encompassed. The goal is really to get the mid-range of whatever it is, whatever test strip, that what it measures from top to bottom, making sure that the target that you want is right in the middle of whatever you buy. So that's pretty important. So those are some key concepts to think about with respect to test strips. The other thing too is don't take for granted that you know if you're buying the same brand test strip, but you're buying a low concentration and a high concentration. Don't take for granted that the same process is used for measuring using that test. Read the directions. Always read the directions, because there's differences, little differences between, even in the same brand, between like the low and the high concentration test strips that are pretty important. So pay attention to the directions. Always read them. Okay, there's a couple questions I know came in. Should you be using PPE when you use the Sanidate at proper dilution when packing vegetables? That's a good question. Elliot, I'm one of those people I'm way more cavalier than I looked in that video. So, yes, I'll use gloves when I'm measuring the stuff out, but once it's mixed, I'm like, boo, it's all good. So I guess that actually is another one I'd hand back to Amanda. Amanda, is PPE required once it's mixed?
Well, so I guess it depends on how you're using it, because typically those things, you'll wash it, and then, what I've seen is most people do wear gloves, and I'm trying to think back to a label. I don't know if the label says that or not.
I just threw the link to the label in the chat box. I'm looking at it now.
Okay.
I know for mixing it requires PPE, but I don't know.
It does say mixing, loading, application, or other tasks, but
yeah. I'm like, and like Chris said in the chat, he's seen me get burned with the Sanidate in front of people, no less. It was like, oh Lord. So yeah, it was bad. Let's see if there's anything else in there. No, I guess that's the only real question. So the rest are responses, I think. So, but yeah, I mean, so those are some key considerations when using test strips that you really need to think about, is making sure that you're getting the right range for what you're aiming for. So be thoughtful about, like, if you're using Sanidate, there's a certain concentration. If you're using Sanidate for cleaning versus Sanidate for wash water, like in the wash water. So pay attention to having the test strip go with that. It's really important. And be thoughtful about those things. Who's used test strips before in wash water or cleaning solutions? Anybody use stuff like that? Is that okay? A couple hands. Okay. So what were your experiences, Lucy?
and folks should feel free to unmute themselves over in the bottom left-hand corner. You can go ahead and.
I've used them in milk containers. So I test to make sure I have enough iodine in the milk container to properly wash it, and then I rinse it, and then I sanitize it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So have you always hit the right, how do you, okay.
Well, I measure it, and then I'll put the test strip in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Does anyone else use either PAA or and I apologize if I'm asking the same questions Amanda did. Do folks use PAA or chlorine in their cleaning and sanitizing?
Is there anybody also who is sort of afraid to use a sanitizer because it seems challenging to use all these test strips? And I wonder if there's anyone out there who's sort of interested or reluctant to use any of these products too. And if you have questions that might help make you feel more comfortable.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Elliot?
Oh, yeah. Hi. This is so I worked at a farm for 8 or 9 years, and we never used it. But I have a new job, and they wanted me to start using it. So I've definitely not 100% of the way there. So I'm glad I've learned a lot tonight. Because I talked to the manufacturers. I'm like a worry wart, so I got the exact amount. I just use two 100-gallon tubs. So I do one where I rinse, get the dirt off, and then the other one I add I add like 10 ounces of Sanidate. So like I didn't know that there was the thing to open up the big opening, so I've been pouring it out of the tiny air hole, and of course splashing it all over the place. So that was good to know.
For what it's worth, I did the same thing for a long time. So,
And then I haven't been using the test strips because I've kind of just been going like eyeballing the turbidity, because I'm just like, well, the water's clear. I've only been washing for a few hours, so I'm gonna get some test strips because clearly that's the wrong thing. I guess if you could, because it seems like with the Sanidate at least, if you get a lot of dirt in the water, it's just no good. So like,
actually, Sanidate works pretty well with dirt.
oh, okay.
That's why that's why it's so much more expensive. Chlorine, you get a little bit of dirt in the water, you wait 2 hours and there's nothing left. The nice thing about Sanidate is it goes. I mean,
Okay.
for
All
days.
right, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So with using a big tub, it's pretty easy to just quick and dirty. You dump it in there. In terms of like the more complicated stuff, like the fogging, the root vegetables and stuff like that, is there like more quick and dirty ways to, like, if you wanted to get some Sanidate on your potatoes for storage so they like would hold a little longer, or is that more of a complicated kind of thing?
So Sanidate's a weird thing, and in fact, they had to settle a really big lawsuit with Bolthouse with respect to carrots, because Sanidate's really good at wiping out bacteria, but it's terror on yeasts. I mean, it does nothing for yeasts. So you can have secondary like post-harvest rots settle in that are yeasts that Sanidate doesn't even touch. And as soon as you've cleared the field for the yeasts, those yeasts go crazy. So be really, I mean, and some things like algae, for instance, Sanidate doesn't touch algae. So like, for instance, we've had people that are managing like nurse tanks of water that they've been putting chlorine bleach in because the PAA does nothing for them. So it's a hard thing to balance. I would do a little research before you assume that just bringing it on there is going to do your job. I wouldn't do everything and then wake up with like your entire crop of potatoes go mushy or something nasty like that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Carmen looked like she had a question, like she unmuted for a second and then she remuted. And I just want to.
Yeah, kind of. I'm a small grower, but I grow for a family, which is mine, that has 52 members in it. And we're raw foodists. So we're very concerned about what sanitizers that we're using. So we really don't use them. What we have is alkaline water machines, industrial levels, with ORH levels in them and pH that are preset, and we clean and we sanitize the machine often. And also we do use the milk crates, and we test the waters and we put the crates in so it's like an in and out process. The crates are cleaned twice. Once they come in, they're cleaned twice before they go back out into the field. So I've been trying to study a lot of the sanitizers that are out here and the disinfectants that are utilized. And at this point right now, I'm kind of like where I am. I'm just like, I'm afraid to use them because we do eat a lot of produce, which is considered not consumable for raw as far as PSA is concerned. So that's where I am, and I'm just trying to get some of the fear out of trying to use these sanitizers. We do test a lot. We do use a lot of pH strips. We also use a lot of Brinks machines to be able to make sure that we're not carrying over any pathogens, and we're looking at the vitamin contents of the food on small samples. But it's really hard. I mean, it really, really is hard. And I'm learning, I'm going through Angelica Farms in Wisconsin and Moses in her boots. So anything that's related to washing and packing, I'm going. And I'm seeing all of these chemical processes that people are using. And it's frightening. It really is frightening. And I'm glad to have this farm because I am feeling a little bit more at ease about the process of using them. But until I'm 100% convinced that the process that I'm using now, I'm going to stick with it.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so we are a few minutes over time, and so there are a few more things in the chat, but I don't want to keep people too long, and we can respond to any other questions in notes after in the meeting that we'll send out. Thank you so much to Amanda Deering from Purdue University. We really appreciated all that information about sanitizers, and to Phil Tocco from Michigan State University on using these sanitizers, and for a truly amazing video. Thank you very much.